Such a warm welcome.
Wow.
I know. It's exciting. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all. Yeah, I mean, I love that. I grew up in a black church, so I love when people respond. That's fantastic. I'm so excited to be here, particularly with you, right? I think this is kind of a moment of geeking out a little bit for me, just because as somebody who uses critical race theory in his own research and has taught critical race theory before, I've obviously used a lot of your work, and so this is just amazing to be able to do this with you. And so I'm really, really excited about this discussion that we're going to be having today. And so I want us to dive right in, because I know this is a really big topic. So in the past few years, what we've seen is that critical race theory has really become this focal point of conversation and debate in our country around issues of education and beyond, which we're going to get into today. And many people have talked about it or written about it, including, of course, academics and intellectuals like yourself, but also, right, media pundits and legislators. Actually, I would say it's probably fair to say that before the past few years, I don't know that we've ever had like a sitting president talking about something like critical race theory.
That's right.
In the on the national stage. And so as most people know, right, a lot of folks, particularly those who are most vocal in their opposition to CRT, they don't actually know what it is. They really are confused, I think. In fact, a lot of people probably think of it as a bit of everything at this point. And so I would really love if you could just start us off by giving us a brief overview of CRT, what it is, how it originated, and how it's used.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, South by Southwest. Yeah. So I am honored to have this conversation with you and have this conversation in front of so many of you who are doing the important work of securing our democracy by educating our children. And Jonathan, you're so right. So many people who've been talking about critical race theory have no idea what it is, but that's part of the point. You don't have to have any idea what you're talking about these days, no, particularly. It's actually better if you don't know what you're talking about. So what critical race theory is, basically the recognition and the study of why colorblind policies don't necessarily produce racially equitable outcomes, is not what those who are critiquing critical race theory tell us it is. What they have framed critical race theory as is basically a Trojan horse for attacking the entire anti-racist social justice infrastructure that developed in the latter part of the 20th century. That's more or less what the point of the attack is. But it has come to my attention, if we take them seriously, that critical race theorists are people who seek to divide us. They're people who seek to make our children feel bad. They're bringing foreign ideas, and the idea is just to keep us at loggerheads with each other and make it impossible for us to maintain our democracy. So it makes sense for us, if this is true, to figure out who these pesky critical race theorists actually are. And they could be here. They could be mingling among us. And you might be worried about whether the person sitting beside you, or even you, might be a critical race theorist. So to put your concerns at ease, we have a quick little test. And we're going to ask you 5 questions to see if the critical race theorists might be among us. So those who are able to, because we want to see clearly, those who are able to, please stand.
Stand up right now.
Stand. All right, listen very carefully to these test questions. If your answer to this question is A, I want you to sit down. You do not have to worry. You are not a critical race theorist. If the answer is B, keep standing, you might be. Okay, so are you ready? Yes. All right. You're in a brainstorming meeting to present some new ideas for the business that you work at. An African-American colleague of yours, let's say Keisha, raises a new idea that she's been thinking about for a number of weeks. Keisha's idea not only solves a serious marketing problem, but expands the mission of the company in a creative way. Keisha's contribution is entirely dismissed, almost as though she hadn't said a word. 20 minutes later.
Y'all already know.
Karen and Ken say exactly the same thing. The supervisor acts as though Karen and Ken are the second coming, and he immediately installs them in managerial roles, supervising Keisha in executing this idea. So now, here comes A. Sit down if you think that Keisha probably didn't speak clearly enough, or her idea was jumbled or somewhat incoherent. You can sit down. Keep standing if you think that this is a textbook example of the implicit biases that routinely undervalue and overlook the superior performances of people of color, women, and other socially marginalized groups at work. Okay, let's keep going. Let's keep going. Question number 2. You hear on the news that a famous Oscar-winning African-American actor is arrested in a New York bodega for stealing a sandwich. A, if you think, tisk, 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 even wealthy, famous black people are not above stealing a sandwich, you can sit down. Keep standing if you think that class is not an automatic pass to being racially profiled and falsely accused in a New York corner store. If you opt for B, okay, you gotta keep standing. All right, check in, how are folks doing?
Looks good. A lot of people still standing.
All right, here's another one. This might separate the wheat from the chaff. You read in your local newspaper that a black couple gets their home appraised after making substantial improvements in a seller's market. The appraiser values their home at less than what they invested in it. After they take down their artwork, they take down the pictures of their black family, every other indicator of blackness is removed from their walls. Their white friend comes and poses as the homeowner, and the appraisal is now $300,000 more. If you think, A, there must have been a clerical error, that decimal point kind of got moved in the wrong direction, then you can sit down. Keep standing if you know that this is a classic example of how discrimination in the housing market continues to diminish black wealth. Okay, all right, I don't know. All right, here's another one. After the video of the killing of George Floyd surfaces, you hear of countless black parents sitting down to give their children the talk. Sit down if you think, well, this is an odd time to be giving a talk about the birds and the bees. Keep standing if you know that this is exactly what black parents do to increase the likelihood that their children will survive an encounter with the police. All right, here's the last one, especially appropriate for educators. So you learned that in your district, less than 10% of graduating seniors can correctly identify slavery as the cause of the Civil War. Sit down if you think that's not a problem, that's exactly how it should be. The cause of the Civil War was not about slavery. Keep standing if you understand that this example is the example of the ignorance about how resorting to violence to uphold a racist system is exactly what broke our country before and may continue to undermine our country in the future. If your option is B, keep standing. Okay, now, guys, I don't know if this is good news or bad news. I want you to take a look around. And I guess I'm going to congratulate you. This is what critical race theorists look like. It's you. It is all of the ways that you understand, recognize, and can interpret social phenomena through the reality that race still matters in our society. It matters in terms of how we are treated. It matters in terms of wealth. It matters in terms of what we teach. It matters in terms of whether we can defend our democracy. So it may be good news to know that this idea about critical race theorists is actually what we think, what we do, how we see. If that's good news to you, congratulations. If it's bad news to you, I'm sorry. Go ahead and take a seat.
All right, and so when we think about this, right, I know you and I have spoken about this a little before. We've had some great conversations. And you brought this idea of kind of weaponizing CRT as like a Trojan horse almost, right? And so what have been some of the more dubious consequences of this Trojan horse definition of CRT, right? The backlash against CRT really serves in many ways as like a scapegoat or a distraction from all of the things that are happening in education and beyond, right? We think about the book bans that are happening in classrooms, the limitations being placed on what can be taught, the revisionist histories that are being given around, especially African American history, among a lot of other things, right? You actually spoke about this a little bit at our annual legislative conference with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation last year. And so before I get your response to that, we have a video we want to show really quickly from Courageous Conversations that really captures some of this crisis engulfing the country. So after we play that, please tell us a little bit more about what you think is happening right now.
We are in America confused. We say we value liberty, but remove Dr. King from classrooms. We value bravery, but rip Ruby Bridges from textbooks. We believe in the American dream, but erase the dreamers who paved the way for our dreams. When the land of the free censors the stories we teach, we erase values we believe in. And without those, we are nothing but an America erased.
Yeah.
Great.
So, since 2020, the backlash against the massive mobilization that happened across the country in every state, there were protests in response to the killing of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. The reaction to that fueled a modern moral panic about how we think and how we move against racism. That moral panic has taken on a legislative dimension. Some of you may remember in 2020 that President then Trump signed an executive order effectively banning equal opportunity, diversity, equity, inclusion training at the federal level. It was rescinded, of course, by President Biden. By that time, the horse had gotten out of the barn, and it has traveled across the country. At this point, 23 states in the union have passed legislation that limits the way race and racism can be taught to our children. Over 22 million school children are impacted by these laws. That's nearly half of the children that go to public schools. Beyond that, these laws, sometimes they've been called divisive concepts laws, they have been called anti-CRT laws, they've been called laws against wokeness. have spread to impacting librarians, libraries, and now has metastasized into book bans and into now aggressive attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
What many people don't realize is, number one, this is an old page out of a very old book. One of the first things that happened at the end of Reconstruction was an attack on political participation and an attack on education. One of the most important things that came out of Reconstruction was the idea that citizenship requires not only the right to vote, but the right to learn, the right to be literate, the right to understand the contours of our situation. So it's not an accident that when we're rolling back, moving away from that societal consensus about what's necessary to create full inclusive citizenship, one of the first things that goes is full inclusive education.
Absolutely.
So when we think about these book bans and we wonder, why is Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail being taken out of coursework? Why do we not have Audre Lorde? Why do we not have these ideas that have been so central to being able to explain that what happened to George Floyd wasn't just about one individual racist police officer? It was about a broader structure of institutional exclusion. It was about a broader way in which implicit biases work out. It was about a broader way in which laws permit and allow police to do certain things without being held accountable. This is what we call structural racism. These are all the things that are being taken out, and they're being taken out along the idea that this is necessary for our future generation not to be burdened by racism. But look, not talking about racism does not destroy racism. Not talking about racism is a tool of racism. And that is the idea that we have to be willing to push back against. The oldest idea is that racial inclusion violates the civil rights of those who believe they have the right to exclude. That was the argument that was given against the Freedom Riders. That was the argument that was given against emancipation. And that is now the argument that has been taken out, laundered, and reproduced now to force us to give up the legacy that we've all inherited from the last 70 years.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, this is not new at all. This is not just about CRT, as you've been saying, right? And so again, you and I have really talked about some of what's been happening in this moment of attack against CRT, but more importantly, this attack against race consciousness at large. And so one of the main things that you've highlighted is that a big response to this anti-CRT mobilization is what you called a pivot. And so could you elaborate on this idea for us? Like, in what ways have we seen people and institutions pivoting away from the issue, and what has that done to our race-conscious landscape?
Yeah. Well, you know, again, one of the oldest tricks of the book, and this is what those who have been attacking critical race theory, wokeness, DEI, have repeatedly said. You know that average that says, when people tell you who they are, believe them. When people come after ideas that are important to us and they tell us why, we need to believe them. So those who came after critical race theory made it clear. We're coming after public education. We're coming after the ideas around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're coming after the histories that tell the truth about where we've come from to be better able to navigate the current moment and where we're going. They told us what it was. But what too many people did when they initially came after critical race theory is they did a pivot. They said, oh, that's not us, that's not what we do. No, that's not a description of what goes on in our classroom. Of course, that's not a description of what goes on in our classroom, but to distance ourselves from this set of critical thinking, ways of thinking about race and racism that aren't just caught up in colorblindness, when we distance ourselves, it made it seem as though there was a problem with critical race theory. And it also made it harder for us to push back against the actual things that they said they were coming against. They said they're coming against diversity, they're coming against social emotional learning, they're coming against fully inclusive history. So when we said that's not us, we basically were not defending what is good and just and legitimate for us to be teaching in a fully multiracial democracy. So the pivot was our own contribution. And when I say own, I'll include myself. The first couple of months, I was like, well, if people were actually teaching the course critical race theory in K through 12, I would know about it. You know, I didn't get a lot of book orders from Texas.
Right.
So I knew that wasn't happening, but of course that wasn't the point. The point was to try to discredit, to defame, and then force us to distance ourselves from what it is that we actually do think is important to do. So when we don't defend, or more importantly, when our mainstream institutions do not do their due diligence in, first of all, reporting accurately what's happening, and second, resisting the effort to force them to distance themselves from these ideas, we become an arm of a far-right project. So if we look at the papers, the newspapers, the papers of record, what they were able to do was to be an echo chamber for those who started this in the far right-wing extremist newspapers, and then our newspapers just picked it up without really reporting it, without really saying what's really happening. And so then it became simply critical race theory, good or bad, right? Not, well, what is it really? Who is behind this? What is the money behind it? What are they trying to do? How it is undermining public education? And I'd be remiss if I didn't say it wasn't just the newspapers.
Sure.
It's also educational institutions. There's, you all know about the huge controversy about the AP Advanced Placement African American Studies course that included many of the ideas that made the course possible after the George Floyd killing, ideas about structural racism, intersectionality. Research was done that showed that these were key ideas in teaching AP African American Studies, and then it ran into the anti-woke buzzsaw that was Florida. DeSantis gave a whole list of ideas that they would not accept in their course, and lo and behold, for whatever reason, who knows, many of these ideas were no longer taught. And what was said was, why should we teach, for example, intersectionality when the idea has been undermined and attacked and politicized? Well, what that does is gives a heckler's veto to those who've decided which ideas are too progressive, are too useful, and they want to take it away. When someone wants to take something away from you, you best believe it's because it's an important idea. Absolutely. Because it does important work. So millions of people all over the world use these ideas, including intersectionality. So when an institution, a gatekeeping institution, simply decides, well, our business model tells us that we have to abide by what DeSantis says, or what Texas says, or what another state says, and take it out, they've contributed to creating an apartheid education system. It's just like the apartheid and the segregation in the past, where there was one set of practices in one set of states and another more inclusionary set of practices in another state. So if you're riding on a bus in the north, you pass the Mason-Dixon, you gotta go to the back of the bus. Well, our education system is becoming that now. You can teach certain ideas in some states, but when you go somewhere else, you teach a different set of ideas. That has never worked for building a multiracial democracy. It did not work in the past, and it will definitely not work in the current moment, and it's up to us to tell our institutions, you cannot accommodate these efforts to distort our history and undermine our capacity to live together in the full understanding of who we've been and in a full commitment to turning ourselves into the multiracial democracy that we deserve to be.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well observed, yes. Yes. It's really interesting too, because I think about the fact that, before I was working at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, I was an educator, I was a professor in Florida, right, of all places. And so, you can imagine what my life was like as I was trying to teach some of these concepts and things, being somebody who focused on race. And what I noticed was that the institutions were doing the work themselves of the people who are fighting against these issues, right? They were pulling things. Actually, just recently, I think, was the past couple of days that the University of Florida announced that they were cutting all of the diversity, equity, inclusion positions at the institution.
Firing everybody.
Exactly.
And within the last 2 days, they also passed a law that prohibits structural racism and other ideas from being part of teacher training for everyone. So now this is, it started with parental rights. It started with children are too young. And now no one can learn about the ways in which race and racism are not simply a matter of prejudiced people. It's a matter of institutions that have been shaped in a particular past that continue to reproduce certain outcomes unless we are aware of it and have the tools to take it out of these systems. I sometimes liken racial exclusion, racism, structural racism to like asbestos. We built our institutions many times with toxic materials back in the time that's what everybody did. Imagine if our approach to asbestos was the same as this approach to color blindness.
Wow.
What is the solution to brown lung disease? The solution is we're not going to say the word asbestos. We're not going to teach people to find it in the institutions. We're going to make it illegal to actually teach people how to determine whether our institutions actually have this toxic material. And we're going to say the people who talk about the toxic material are the source of the toxicity, not the fact that the material was put in those institutions in the first place. That wouldn't make any sense at all if we cared about the health of the population in those institutions. And it makes no greater sense if we care about the health of our democracy and the well-being of our children across race. Yet that is exactly what they are doing in trying to take away our tools to be able to navigate, to understand, to remove these toxic materials and make our society what we claim it is.
Absolutely, yeah, I love that. I would clap for that too. I love that idea. I've never thought of it that way, but it makes so much sense. And so, we're talking about education and the consequences of removing certain things or limiting the ways in which people can learn about information. And so, again, what we see is this over and over again, a consequence of not getting a comprehensive education is just not being fully aware of history, right? And so we've already talked about the fact that this is not new, right? None of this is new. You've also talked about us being in this period now of kind of like a new reconciliation, right? Where the goal is to pursue peace at the cost of addressing continued inequalities. And so could you just elaborate on that a little bit for us?
Well, as we were saying earlier, nothing is new about any of this. And there's another adage, those who don't know history, bound to repeat it.
Yep.
We're living through history that feels very familiar to a past moment. When we did decide that citizenship meant particular things, citizenship meant greater access to democracy. They didn't get it fully right after Reconstruction because they kind of didn't decide that women deserved the right to play a role. But it was in progress. There was a decision that laws were necessary to protect us from sensibilities that were grounded in a past. It was a decision that education, which at a certain point had been illegal, right? One of the ways to keep structures of inequality in place is to make sure that people are not literate. That's why at one time it was not only against the law, but in some places punishable by death to teach enslaved people how to read. So there's a connection between maintaining levels of illiteracy and maintaining existing power structures. We understand that what happened at the end of Reconstruction was redemption, basically redeeming the old way, going back to when things used to be better, right? What does that sound like? So again, we're in a moment where the effort to return to a past involves some of those same tools, denying people the full right to vote, denying people the right to water while they're in line to vote. We can see how the efforts to suppress political participation that was made possible after the Shelby case said, look, you know, vote discrimination was a long time ago. We don't have to worry about that anymore. And what, the next day, right here, anti-voting legislation was passed. We get how that's a reflection of the past. We often don't get how the attack on ideas, the attack on frameworks, the attack on education is also a reflection of that same idea. So what we're facing now feels very much like reconciliation of the past. It's important to realize that, you know, the end of Reconstruction and the normalization of segregation, of other forms of internal oppression of groups of color didn't just happen because one faction was powerful enough to take away these important concepts. It also happened because another group decided to stop fighting. It happened because people decided to accommodate. It happened because people wanted to get on with the business of business and didn't want to fight anymore about the rights of people of color, or the rights of women, or the rights of immigrants. They wanted to move on. So they were willing to negotiate away these rights in order to move on. Sure. We are concerned and should be very, very vigilant about recognizing that our fight now is not just with this extremist faction. Mm-hmm. The fight is with our own folks who, as you say, are doing some of the work of censoring themselves. So, for example, after this last anti-affirmative action case was passed by the Supreme Court that had to do with 2 universities, institutions across the United States are like, well, we better take diversity out of our mission, or we better stop having recruiting programs that acknowledge that we need to do more to make sure that our institutions are racially inclusive. They are doing the work that the extremists want us to do. Now remember, that did not happen on the other side. Right. When Brown versus Board of Education was decided, you didn't get people saying, well, let's figure out all of the ways that the implication of integration should impact everything that we do. They did the opposite. It was massive resistance. Mm-hmm. You have to make us do this. Well, we need to have more of a spirit of resistance against this backward turn in American society. Absolutely. We need to fight like our lives depend on it, because they do.
They do, they absolutely do, right? And I love that connection that we keep coming back to the Reconstruction, because I really see such significant parallels between what happened in Reconstruction, the period, and then right after, and then what's happening now, as you've been talking about, right? Kind of the removal of things. You can look at like the social messaging campaigns that are happening right now to reestablish racial hierarchies in a sense, right? Or to the white supremacist domestic terrorism that we're seeing continue to like curtail Black progress and the progress of other people of color and other marginalized groups, right? So we're seeing that exact same thing happening now, and so it's really important for us to not relive those exact same things of the past. So then what's important for us to think about is what does this all mean for our society today, right now, right? What are some of the lasting impacts that we're gonna see or that we're currently seeing with this backlash against race consciousness, right? And why is this so important for us all here at South by Southwest EDU to be talking about?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that has been so distressing is to see how something that started in one institution and with respect to one population now has metastasized across American society, and in particular, how this anti-woke war has penetrated our culture in the stories that we tell about who we are. So we've just come last month from the Sundance Festival, in which we wanted to engage creatives with an understanding about how the banning of much of the source material for the things that become the stories we tell about ourselves will impact the future of popular culture. So we wanted to share with South by Southwest the video that we shared there.
Sure.
Most Americans, I'm going to even suggest all Americans, walk around with a false narrative of who we are, of what this country is. It's what we were taught in school. It is a narrative of greatness. It is a narrative of achievement, but it is false because it is incomplete.
On January 6th, that incomplete story about who this country really belongs to turned into a deadly assault on our democracy. Thousands of insurrectionists, activated by a story of existential loss of something exclusively theirs, stormed the Capitol to take their country back.
It's our country, we want it back!
But where does the story of who belongs and who decides come from? In what ways do the stories we tell and don't tell undermine the stability of our multiracial democracy? Since the narrow survival of our democracy in 2021, we've been asking those questions at Sundance through the story of us. This big conversation has become more urgent as attacks on our history, knowledge, and experience have only intensified. This assault on our stories is not new. It is part of the history of American cinema and its own history of erasure. From the Civil War revisionism in Birth of a Nation, the romanticism of slavery in Gone with the Wind, the celebration of manifest destiny in our westerns, the jingoism of war, to the Hays Codes and the 50s era blacklisting that punished the storytellers who pushed us to widen the aperture to a fuller story of who we are. From cinema's dawn, Black storytellers have used the genre to offer a more expansive, honest, and sometimes sobering portrayal of the nation. But this tradition is directly threatened by book bans. Today, nearly half of American school children are subject to laws limiting what they can learn, think, and feel about our past. Many beloved movies, from cult classics to critically acclaimed projects, draw inspiration from books and authors that are now banned. This is not a drill. We've seen this movie before, and we know how this plot ends. The time to craft a different ending is now. Our freedom to live in a fully realized multiracial democracy depends on our freedom to learn the full story of who we are, where we have come from, and where we are going. To tell the story of us, we must free our storytellers. We must free our books.
Great. Thank you. So I'm glad we were able to share that with the audience. And so, I think right now at this point, we've really outlined the issue, the problems that exist in this moment, and the significance of what's happening, right? But I think one of the most important questions is, where do we go from here, right? What do we do? And so what can people who are listening to this conversation that we've been having do to affect change?
Yeah. The juggernaut is significant, right?
Yeah.
This has been a multi-decade strategy. So we need to recognize that although the fire was lit in 2020, the kindling had been collecting for decades. So we need to just recognize that. It is important to also recognize that we are the majority.
Amen.
We sometimes forget that the majority of Americans are against book bans. The majority of Americans want a country in which everybody has a place. The majority of Americans want their children to be fully educated and integrated into society. So we can't let ourselves be fooled into believing, because of the saturation over the airwaves of a tiny faction of Americans, that we don't have the power. The problem is we have to learn how to use it more effectively. So one of my good friends, Sherilyn Ifill, always says, don't leave power on the table. And too many times we are not as involved as we should be on the local level. We are not as involved as we should be in running for the Board of Education. Our retired teachers are hugely important resources that we need to be constantly bringing into the mix. So that's number one. Number two, across the country, we need to be able to measure, and we need to be able to show the power of those who believe in the freedom to learn. That's why one of the things that we've been been involved in. It's number one. An unbanned book tour. We've been to over 20 states passing out for free the books that they don't want us to read. People need to see and witness and feel what they're trying to take away from us. So support giving away these books for free. Support the Freedom to Learn Day of Action. We now do this every year on May 3rd with thousands of events across the country. They need to hear a cacophony of sound, of resistance to the idea of literally taking out the words out of our mouths. So whether it's a book reading, whether it's a protest, whether it's a teach-in, we all need to do things to show that we have more power, more voice, more determination to fight back against the efforts to erase us. And lastly, we need to know where our representatives stand on this. We need to let them know that this is important not only to us, but to our future. Those who cannot speak the past cannot navigate their future, and that is the point of this extremism. So, you know, Martin Luther King had a wonderful statement in which he says, you know, they tell us, you know, that we shouldn't be extreme. I am an extremist for democracy. I am an extremist for multiracial inclusion. And if that means that we need to go to these school boards, if that means we need to tell our elected officials we care about democracy, inclusion, freedom of speech, and freedom of thought, if it means we have to say we will not be a country that allows ourselves to devolve in the way that we see other countries devolving, if it means we have to go to the mat, then it's time for us to do it.
Absolutely. Well said. Very, absolutely, yeah. I love it. I mean, I agree with all of that. I think that's really great. So obviously we want people to engage with your organization, the African American Policy Forum. Some of the things that I would say too, just from the perspective of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, right? I would tag right onto that in terms of being politically engaged, right? That is something that we do at the foundation, and we want everybody else to do as well, right? Write your elected officials, call them up, right? Demand accountability, demand action. Obviously make sure you're registered to vote and exercise that right? There's a reason why people are working so hard to make it difficult for you to vote. Again, paying attention to the ways in which people are trying to stop stuff, that means that's probably something you want to do when you're thinking about that, right? If you're in the DC area, coming up September 11th through 15th, CBCF is hosting its 53rd annual legislative conference, and that's the largest Black public policy conference in the nation. That's just a great opportunity to be connected with officials, with politicians and legislators. It's an opportunity to connect with organizations like yours, right, who are local and national groups who are doing this work, who are on the ground really involved in affecting change, right? We want people to get involved in these processes. I actually really hope that we'll be able to do something again. I know we did something last year. And then lastly, I would say educate yourselves, right? I mean, as you can tell just from the discussion that we've been having today, it's really important for people to learn, to know about these things, right? We've already highlighted how most people don't really even know what critical race theory is. Now, all of you all, since you all have identified yourself as critical race theorists, go out and tell the masses, right? Part of our mission at the CBCF is to educate the public. And so, you know, you can go to our website to engage with our research that talks about some of these issues. You know, for instance, one of our John R. Lewis Social Justice Fellows, Dr. Jalea Taylor, she recently wrote a piece that's really connected to the work we're talking about today on preserving the integrity of American education, right? We are a resource. The African American Policy Forum is a resource for you all to educate yourselves and to go out and educate the public. So yeah, this has been a great discussion. I think at this point I would love to take we have some questions from the audience that we can try to answer as well.
Yeah.
And so
some of these are great.
They really are. I was trying to decide which one was the first one.
Well, let me do the one that basically some of the common critiques that we hear from white parents is that they don't want their children to feel ashamed.
Yes.
You know, how should we respond to this? And you know, I think the best answer to this is from Tim Wise, who is an amazing white, Southern, male, anti-racist trainer. He said, if you are worried that your children are being ashamed by history, then you're exposing them to the wrong history. There are plenty of stories of multiracial coalitions coming together to embody the full promise of America. The story of our history is not all people of color on one side and all white people on the other side. That is a false, narrow vision of history. That is not what teachers are teaching. That is not what critical thinking about race is about. In fact, it is the opposite. So critical thinking about race isn't saying that race and racism is all a product of bad, evil white people. That is the narrow vision of race and racism. That is what critical thinking about race was meant to challenge. Absolutely. You know, it's not about that. It is about how some of the policies, some of the practices, some of the values that were created during the time that our institutions were not racially inclusive continue to live on and create some of the same outcomes. So it is about some of the built-in ways that the original deal continues to deal out certain consequences. It also is the case that greater academic achievements are routinely connected to telling and teaching a more inclusive curriculum. One of the most important battles about this happened around a Mexican-American program that was challenged in one of our states for being racially exclusionary. And there was a whole law that was created that said you cannot teach these children their history. Well, what the evidence showed is children did better when they saw themselves in the story of who we are. They did better not just in that course, but in everything. They were more likely to go to college, and they were more likely to stay in college, and more likely to do well. So if we want all of our children to do well, we have to teach all of them, not just one story, not just one piece, but the entire story. And it also turns out that white children also do well as well. It's not the idea that this is a zero-sum game. That's what the extremists want us to believe. It's not a zero-sum game. To be able to learn and to be aware and to be critical and conversant about how our society was formed, what some of the continuing issues are, how we can all work better to perfect our democracy. That is education for all of us, not just for some of us.
Absolutely, yeah. Good. Yeah, I think that the idea of discomfort to me is so interesting as well when I think about this, right? Like the fact that we have so many different folks that we can identify with, yet people often push that white children in particular should be, for some reason, identifying only with the side of quote unquote shame, right? Yes. When there were so many white abolitionists, when there were so many white people who were on the right side of history fighting for certain things, why not identify with those individuals?
Goodman and Schwerner, who were killed along with Cheney in Mississippi. Who's telling that story? Who's telling children that there were white people who put their lives on the line to make this country what it should be? I actually think that part of what the resistance is resistance to empathy, resistance to that was not a right and good thing for Ruby Bridges to have to go to school by herself for a year, a 6-year-old. Yet the Moms for Liberty basically have objected to children learning Ruby Bridges' story. Why wouldn't you want children to learn about how another child in the past experienced discrimination in order to be committed to the idea that that is not how our country should be organized? Why do we want to deprive them of the ability to connect with these stories through connecting with another child? That's about empathy, and empathy is what we need in order to put ourselves in the position of an other, to better understand and to better respond to the continuing dimensions of some of our historical challenges.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, that idea of empathy, I think, really connects well to another question in terms of somebody's asking what strategies we could recommend or would you recommend for fostering productive conversations about CRT, I would argue beyond CRT even too, like we've been discussing, when it's met with resistance or skepticism or maybe a lack of empathy?
Yeah, well, you know, some part is what we did today. So we actually tested what people actually know. test what people actually think. So for a moment, we have to step away from the distortion and defamatory conversation that's out there and really explore, so how do you explain some of the ways that our social order looks? How do you think we should respond, to the fact that we have a political system, an education system, an economic system that has these particular features? So I think getting beyond the initial resistance by actually trying to talk about what we understand. What do we want for our children? What is the best way to get there? Is denial the way to go? How does that work in any other context? So I think that there are many people who have been misinformed and can be brought into a meaningful conversation. I don't think everybody is. It's clear that some people don't want to have these conversations. That's always been the case. We're not going to be able to talk to everyone and talk them into thinking about more inclusion if they don't want inclusion. But if we do want inclusion, the terms upon which it has to happen has to be based on an honest confrontation about what are some of the mechanisms that create exclusion. And that might be also a way to talk about intersectionality, because number one, it's also important to recognize critical race theory is not just about the African American experience. It is the case that the stereotypes that are associated with anti-Blackness is kind of like the Trojan horse, in which all other kinds of resistance is packed. That's what we saw. They came after critical race theory. They basically talked about African American people, and before we knew it, it was now LGBTQIA people. Then it became immigrants. Then it became people who are differently abled. Now it's all diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when race becomes the lost leader in democracy, everything eventually becomes impacted by it. Intersectionality basically says that our experiences of exclusion are often not unidimensional. Those who are subject to exclusions or burdens on the basis of race or sexuality or being differently abled are also sometimes subject to race and gender forms of discrimination. We know that special needs children who are brown and Black have harder challenges trying to get access to the resources they need, and poorer outcomes, particularly when they get caught up in the disciplinary system. Right. So that is an intersectional problem. It's partly a race problem, but it's not exclusively a race problem. It's partly a problem around access to services for differently abled children. So intersectionality basically says that you have to be able to look at the ways in which systems interact, they interface with each other, and sometimes create barriers and obstacles that a one-sided or one prism can't answer to itself. So that is what intersectionality is it's not, trying to turn everything on its head. It's not trying to turn white, straight men into pariahs. It's trying to make sure that no one falls through the cracks of our inclusionary educational and other forms of diverse practices.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I would agree to clap for that. So, earlier in our talk, you talked about this idea of fighting back, right, and making sure that we are not just kind of laying down and giving up on some of this, and so we want to push back. And so I think it's really important for thinking about the educators in the room. One of the questions is, right, that state legislatures control the State Board of Education and the curriculum and the funding, all these different mechanisms of education. So how do people in public schools fight back and keep their jobs, right? What are some ways that they can actively?
Yeah, and that is the challenge of the moment, because the reality is that once state power is captured by a small faction, then losses abound. Yes. Right? People don't want to put their livelihoods on the line. Why should they? So it takes me back to where I started. Number one, we have to realize that this is a political struggle. we have to fight back. We have to take back the school boards. We have to make education precisely the kind of priority in our voting that we make in our day-to-day jobs. So being politically active, recognizing that when the rules are created in a way that take away our ability to do our job, it's time for us to get busy changing the rules. That's number one. We also, need to be connected outside, of our immediate jobs and outside of our immediate state. So across in Florida and other places, what some teachers are doing is coming together with other community groups, churches, retired teachers, creating curricula, creating Saturday schools, creating other means by using social media, the internet, to increase their own education, but also to provide opportunities. In the meantime, we may need to be talking about an underground railroad. We may need to be talking about, alternative formations or education in exile while we are trying to fight back. We at the African American Policy Forum for the last 4 years have offered critical race theory summer school. Yes, I said it, critical race theory summer school, which is online. It is available for students, it's available for teachers, it's available for parents to actually be exposed and teach the kind of things. Why do we need to think critically about race? What does that mean? How is it that it's actually urgent for us to do so? I'll end with this. Some people think that this is a fight just about 3 letters. It is not a fight about 3 letters. We need to be able to think critically about race to understand what's happening.
Yes.
That's the prism that allows us to see that these ideas are ideas that are meant to undermine our democracy, not to enhance it. You need to be able to understand race, not in terms of what Bull Connor does, but in terms of what some of our institutions do. We need to have that lens to understand the asbestos problem in race that we talk about. So that's what we do in Critical Race Theory Summer School. It's for a week in July, it's online. And this year we'll have some people in person to try to create cohorts of teachers and researchers who work better and more effectively when they're able to work collaboratively to save our education system and, frankly, to save our democracy.
Absolutely. So, indeed. All right, well, Dr. Crenshaw, it's been such an honor. Thank you so much. I hope everybody has enjoyed this. Thank you so much. That's all I can say.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.